more announcement while we figure that out. Next Sunday, Abigail didn't mention this, but we have a pretty big kind of event happening here at the school. They are using this school next week for voting. There is a primary happening, I hear, and a voting happening. And apparently, this year in the state of California, you vote not just on Super Tuesday on Tuesday, but voting actually starts, I believe, for 4 full days. And I'm back. Okay, thank you. So, well, do that. We'll get rid of all this. So what does that mean for us? They told us about 2 weeks ago that we would not be able to use this next Sunday. And so we can use every other room except this room next Sunday. And the school district let us know a couple weeks ago about this. And we said, well, that's kind of interesting because every Sunday morning we have a gathering in this particular room. And a lot of people show up and a circle and we worship and we do this. So church will still be happening here next Sunday. That's the good news. Church will still be happening. We have full use of everything that way. And so we're actually kind of excited about this. Everything is going to be happening on that end of the campus next week, including this gathering. And you're like, well, how are we going to do that? Our children will all be in one of the spaces that we rent. There are two other rather large classrooms. And so when you come next Sunday, one of those classrooms is going to be dedicated. Our worship team will be there. It's also a communion Sunday. Next week is it's a first Communion Sunday, and so there will be one classroom that will be dedicated to worship and communion time, and Rainier and his band will be in that classroom, and I will be in the other classroom, and in that classroom there will be a teaching time and ministry time happening. And so when you come next week, our great, wonderful volunteer staff will be meeting you at the curb and telling you where to go, which classroom. Now here's the deal, you're like, well, if I go to one class, no. See, about 40 minutes into the service, we're going to switch. And there's going to be actually a 10 to 15 minute hangout time in the middle. We're calling it Meeting in the Middle, where everybody is going to switch classrooms. But before you switch classrooms, you're going to get coffee and bagels and donuts, and you're going to hang out in that little middle area there. And then you're going to switch classrooms. And if you started with teaching and ministry, you're going to go to worship and communion. And if you started in worship and communion, you're going to go to teaching and ministry time. And that's going to be our service because we are exiles. We have been displaced next week. And we don't know what else to do. So we're like, well, okay, what do we do? Well, we can meet outside under a big tree, but it might rain. You never know. And so we're going to go that way. So come next Sunday, but do not expect this meeting to be happening in here. Everything will be that way, including our children's ministry, and it is going to be awesome. It's going to be very interactive, and I'm looking forward to kind of my role. I know Rainier and his team is looking forward to leading down there. So, parking, thank you. Apparently there will be voting happening next Sunday morning in this room. So we have no idea what parking is going to be like, but there is an auxiliary parking lot down the street that way. Many of you right by LA Fitness, there's this very large parking lot. So if we could even park there or that way in the neighborhood, but kind of avoid this parking lot here, we want to be good guests and leave that open for people that are coming to vote next Sunday morning. And who knows, maybe they will vote and then join us, right? So they can they can vote. And if you're registered to vote, you might as well cast a ballot next Sunday while you're here. You just grab a ballot and get registered, and that'll be all happening in this room. So minor detail. When you show up next Sunday, this room will be occupied, and we're just going with it. So there we go. All right. Enough technical issues with microphones and elections and seating and everything. It's good to be with you this morning. We've been meandering all of 2020 through the Gospel of Mark. And today we find ourselves in chapter 7. So if you have a Bible or a device that you want to flip on or open, we're going to be in Mark chapter 7 today. This is Mark's Gospel. We have been reading Mark's account of the life and the ministry of this Jesus of Nazareth. And Mark tells us from the very beginning, the very opening line of his Jesus story, that what we're reading is good news. This is just the beginning of the good news, and that's where we've been kind of focusing and camped, like I said, for most of 2020. I said this the first week of this series, but I think it's worth repeating. That Mark was evidently, you're like, well, who is this author? Mark was evidently, if we read the book of Acts, Mark was evidently a part of Paul's early missionary journeys. And so he would have traveled around the Roman Empire with the Apostle Paul, spreading the good news of Jesus Christ wherever he went. And so, of course, he had stories aplenty to tell. But one of our early second century church historians, and who doesn't have a favorite early second century church historian, right? I mean, come on now, we all have our favorite. My favorite is a guy by the name of Papias. And Papias writes in the early second century about the Gospel of Mark, and he actually says that what we are reading is Mark's retelling of all of the disciple Peter's Jesus stories, because Mark never really he traveled with Paul but was not with Jesus. And so what Papias says is that the Gospel of Mark is really kind of Mark putting down in literary form everything that Peter told him about what Jesus did and what Jesus taught, essentially Peter's stories. Now, one of the questions that I think is important to ask as we read any of the Gospels or any of the stories from the Bible, but particularly this one, since that's what we've been studying, one of the important questions, I think, would be this. Out of all the material Mark must have had to draw from, because I can guarantee you Peter had a few stories, right, to tell about Jesus. Out of everything he could have written down, why did he write down these stories? Like, of all the material he had, why that particular story? What was the purpose? There must have been some agenda, because he evidently had plenty of material to choose from. One of the other gospel writers by the name of John, who was with Peter, who was one of the inner three disciples, remember? In John chapter 21, we know there must have been more material, because in John chapter 21, here's the last verse, the last line of John's gospel. He writes, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would have room for the books that would be written. That's John's way of telling you what? What I have written down in 21 chapters is just a fraction. There is so much more that Jesus did, that Jesus said, that Jesus taught. There is so much more material, and John's like, the world, now granted this was the first century AD world, and how many books were there really? But he's like, the whole world would not have enough scrolls to write all of these stories down. And so I take you back to the question I just posed. Why would Mark choose those stories? Because apparently there were so many to choose from, and we get just this small fraction. Why would Mark preserve that? Now, I want you to hold that question in tension as we read today's text. But before we get to that, earlier this week, I was going to get something from our garage. And as I reached for that which I was trying to secure in our garage, I stepped on a rake. And when I stepped on the rake, the handle of the rake suddenly, very quickly, sped through time and space and smacked me right in the face. I felt like I was in every Tom and Jerry episode that has ever been made. Because this was me earlier this week trying to get something out of our garage. It was like this, I didn't expect it. I was getting something else. I stepped on a rake. The handle flew up, smacked me in the face, and it kind of shook me for a minute. I wondered if I would have a black eye. I wondered what was going to be happening. Thankfully, there was very little swelling. But when I read Mark's account today, it kind of felt a little bit like stepping on a rake. As I read chapter 7 of Mark, for me, it was a bit of a slap in the face. It was like a, whoa, wake-up call. Like, I didn't expect that, didn't see that coming. It created a bit of tension in me. And it's a Jesus story that as we read it, it may create some tension in your soul as well. And if that happens to you today, if it's a bit unnerving, if it raises more questions than it does answers, if you read it and you don't like what you read, you're like, I do not like that text, I don't like that story, know that you're not, if it feels a little bit like you step on a rake and get smacked in the face with something that's supposed to be good news from Jesus, you're in very good company today. And so when deciding on what to preach and teach this week, I was reading one scholar by the name of Dawn Wilhelm, and she wrote about this text. This is one of the most intriguing and disturbing events recorded in Mark's gospel. So as we had our pastors meeting on Tuesday, and we talked about what we should preach, I'm like, if Dawn says this is one of the most intriguing and disturbing texts that we got to go to that one. That's the one we're doing. I have preached a lot of sermons. I have sat through many more. I've never heard this text preached. I think mostly because it's just so uncomfortable, and we don't really know what to do with it. And so with a lot of humility, we proceed today. But before we get there, I just want to give you a little literary context before our primary text. And the question, again, I want you to hold in tension is, so why would Mark put that story in there? He had so many other Jesus stories to pull from. Why that one? Mark chapter 7 starts with this very kind of lengthy dialogue between Jesus and the religious elite of his day, a faction within first century Judaism known as the Pharisees. And Jesus is in this discussion with the Pharisees because they're really concerned about orphans, widows, and refugees being properly loved, tended, and taken care of. That was a joke. They are not. They have no interest in that. What they're really jazzed up about, what's really firing this religious elite Jewish men up, is that Jesus' disciples have shown up and they're eating with unclean hands. To think. They notice that, wait, your disciple, if you don't, look at Mark chapter 7, verse 5. So the Pharisees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food, with defiled hands? That's their question for Jesus. Why do you let your disciples eat with these defiled hands? They do not go through a ceremonial washing of their hands before they eat, and so thus they are unclean. To which Jesus replies in Mark 7, he quotes Isaiah and says, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. Man, this rabbi's in a mood, is he not? He is throwing some shade their way on this particular day, because when they ask him why he lets his disciples eat with unclean hands, he's like, you know what? The prophet was right when he talked about you hypocrites. And you're like, dang, he's in a prophetic mood. Somebody ruffled his robe. And he continues, and he says, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. Because, how many of you are here today because you just have this unquenchable passion to follow human rules? How many of you showed up for worship today? You're like, I am here today because I can't get me enough law. I need more rules, more regulations. I want more obedience. That's what fuels my worship. My worship is fueled by the following of commandments and laws. That's why I'm here. Jesus says, you honor me with your lips. You say all the right things. Your hearts, he says, are far from me. And the rest of this section is this kind of broad discussion that Jesus enters with them into with these people about what really makes a person unclean. And the rest of the section for Jesus' take, we're not going to read the whole thing. Jesus is like, it's not what passes through your lips. It's not what you eat. It's not eating with unclean hands that makes you unclean. It's the condition of your heart. It's out of the overflow of the heart the mouth speaks. It's what's coming out of you, Jesus says. He's always more interested in what comes out of a person. The inside is of greater importance. He says, this is what makes you unclean. But that's not the part that really smacked me in the face this week. Because I want you to hold that in context as the scene then suddenly shifts. In Mark chapter 7, verse 24, after this 23 verses of this interaction with these religious elite men, Jewish men, the scene suddenly shifts, and in Mark 7:24 it says, Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. Now, parents, who do we ask when we don't know which way to go? Well, our children know. They ask the map, right? Some of you are with me. You know exactly where this is going. You have this very, very, if you've ever been on Nickelodeon, you've got this Dora character, right? Who is very self-aware because tells us every episode 5 times who he is. He's the map, he's the map, he's the map, he's the map, he's the map. Here's the map. This is where we're going. We're in the northwest today. You can see a star up there. It says Jesus left that region and went to the vicinity of Tyre. Tyre is in northwest of Galilee. Last week we were southeast of Galilee. And might I just say that the northwestern section of our circle today is really representing well. Last week it was empty and the southeast was full. This week southeast is a little bit empty, but northwest is looking full because that's where Jesus goes. He goes northwest. Where the Spirit's at work. This is in the province of Syria, modern day. If you're thinking about modern day geography, we're in modern day Lebanon. And so for the second time in as many chapters, what we have Mark telling us right after this interaction with these religious elite people is we have Jesus is crossing barriers. He's crossing boundaries. He's going to a different region where it appears he has not been before, to a place that would be rendered by many to be unclean. And then it says this, he entered a house, and he did not want anyone to know it. Yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose daughter was possessed by an impure spirit fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. And so right after this lengthy discussion about what makes a person unclean, the very next story has Jesus going to a region where unclean people live again, and he has an interaction with somebody who I can guarantee you that the people he was talking to a few verses before would have told you was an unclean person. We'll get to her in a minute. He encounters an unlikely person. It says he enters a home. He's attempting to keep his presence a secret, but he's followed and he's quickly confronted by a woman. Apparently her daughter has been held in bondage by impure spirits. The same thing if you were here last week. We talked about this man from the region known as the Gerasenes, which was in the Decapolis, which was southeast of Galilee, which was in another region, an unclean region. But Jesus persists and goes there and breaks down barriers and boundaries to get to that guy. And now he's going the opposite direction. He's going northwest. And now it's the same thing, though. He meets this woman, but it's not her that's possessed by these demons. It's her daughter, we're told. And the woman falls at Jesus' feet, and it says, begs him to drive the demon out. Now let's talk about this woman for a moment, because Mark describes her, you can see in bold here, as a Greek, and describes her as a woman born in Syrian Phoenicia, which tells us that this woman was non-Jewish. She was a Gentile woman, and it turns out that Jesus is not the only one in this text, in this story. Jesus is not the only one that's crossing barriers. Jesus is not the only one that is crossing perceived boundaries, because this woman reaches out to Jesus, and this woman crosses a couple of barriers and boundaries of her own. Like what? Well, first and foremost, she's a woman and he's a man. In the first century, even in some places today, there's a place in Old City Jerusalem called Mea Shearim, very conservative Jewish religious area, ultra-Orthodox Jews, where it is considered improper, even to this day, 2,000 years later, for a Jewish man to speak publicly with any woman. And so, The first boundary, the first barrier that she crosses, and this is 2,000 years ago, and boy, we've progressed a lot since then, right? Is she's a woman and she goes into the presence and speaks to a man. And the second barrier, or the second boundary that she crosses, that we need to point out, is she's a Gentile and he's a Jewish rabbi. He is among the most respected of men in his community, and she is a Greek born in Syrian Phoenicia, a Gentile. And she breaks both barriers. She talks to Jesus, and she seeks his help as a Gentile woman. And so for the first readers of this story, and for us, I think even today, Mark wants us to see that this whole scene is culturally backwards. It is awkward. It is uncomfortable. Mark's first readers would read this and go, what do you mean she busted in the door? Does she know her place in society? Doesn't she know who he is? But she breaks that barrier. Doesn't she realize she's a Gentile and he's a Jewish rabbi? And Mark wants us to feel the tension. Now, Matthew records the same. There's only one other gospel writer that records this same story, and it's in Matthew. And we know it's awkward, and we know it's created a whole lot of tension, and we know it's made some people uncomfortable, because in Matthew's telling of the story, the disciples who are standing there with Jesus, notice their response. This is Matthew 15. Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." Don't you love the compassion and empathy of Jesus' closest followers? This poor woman comes because her daughter is plagued by an impure spirit, is being tortured, is suffering terribly, and the response of Jesus' closest followers is, please ask her to leave, she won't stop bugging us. The woman says, my daughter is suffering terribly in Matthew's account. And they tell her to leave. Why? They know her place. These are Jewish boys. She's a woman. She's a Greek Gentile woman. What's she doing talking to their rabbi? She's crossed a boundary. She's out of bounds. She needs to be put in her place. They want her gone. Point being, in this text, there are a plethora of boundaries and barriers that should have held this woman back, not the least of which are 12 Jewish boys. It should have held her back. It should have contained her. But what I love about this story, and a part of the story I want to honor today, I love that this unnamed Greek, Syrian Phoenician, Gentile woman doesn't seem to care about any of those boundaries and any of those barriers. She doesn't seem to care. And I don't think she cares for the same reason why I know some of us in this room, you wouldn't have cared either, would you? Because why would you not have? You're a mom. You love your daughter, don't you? You've sat with your daughter and watched her be tormented by this presence of evil in her life. And so it doesn't matter what the Jewish boys say. It doesn't matter that I shouldn't be talking to him. I love my daughter. And I'm going to get my daughter to Jesus because I have heard rumor that he can set people free like her. It's the same way I think we'd hopefully do the same thing. She's willing to bust through all doors, all barriers to get her child to Jesus. Because she knows her daughter is suffering terribly. And she's willing to suffer too. Suffer the humiliation, suffer the potential rejection that she might face. She doesn't care because she wants her daughter at the feet of Jesus. I wonder if she heard the disciples whispering. I wonder if she overheard them saying, hey, Rabbi, send her away. And I happen to wonder if she was like, no, I'm not going to leave. And yes, I'm going to continue to persist. I'm going to keep crying out because I watched that little girl born, and I know she was not created for this. And 2,000 years later, we're still talking about this mom, aren't we? But that's not the part of the story that really bugs me. Because just when you expect Jesus to rebuke his disciples' jaded, calloused, non-compassionate hearts and tenderly love and minister compassion that this woman deserves, you step on a rake. Because look what Jesus says to her. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her. For it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to dogs. Jesus says, what? I mean, when I read that, that was like stepping on a rake again for me. A smack in the face. This has got to be one of the most un-Jesus-like responses we have recorded in the good news about Jesus. That this woman comes to him, begging him to deliver her daughter, from these demons, and his response is, you know what? I shouldn't take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. Now that reference to the children, that is a veiled reference to the Jewish people, the children of God, the chosen people, the children of God. This is a very Jewish way of talking about the Hebrew people. And this reference, talking about bread and tossing it to the dogs, this appears to be a complete slap in the face and slight for the Gentiles, who the Jewish people referred to. There's a Greek word, kunos. That's what they called the Gentiles, the kunos. You know what kunos means? Dogs. And so Jesus says, it shouldn't be right. I shouldn't take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Is Jesus telling a Gentile woman that he really only cares about the Jewish children of God? Does this not bother anybody else in the room? Does this not raise some tension in your own soul? Does this, if we're honest, Jesus' response is not a whole lot better than his disciples, is it? I mean, they just want her to be sent away. Jesus calls her, is like she's a dog. I'm not giving her bread from my table. And for years, I'll be honest, I've taught Mark to 8th grade students for like 12, 13 years now. I've never taught this passage. We just skip right over that one. Because in the next one, he heals a deaf and mute man. And you're like, yeah, he has compassion. He puts his finger in the guy's ears and touches the guy's tongue. Remember that story? I like that story. This one, we skip every year. I don't know what to do. It makes me so uncomfortable. It's a bit awkward. It's seemingly backwards. And I think that's the point. I have come to believe that is the literary point that Mark is making. That is why I want to bring us back to where I started, which is asking, why would Mark, out of all the stories he could have told about Jesus, why include this one that makes him look really bad? Why would he have included this? Why would he have thought this story that needed to be included? And why would Jesus respond this way? I know this the question that many of us in the room have this morning. Why Jesus? Why would you respond this way? And so can I just say a few words about why I think he's responding that way? And then I want to get back to the woman, because I really think she needs to be honored today. And that's really the point I wanted to get to. But just a few words about what I think is going on here and why I think Jesus responds as he does. Remember, Jesus is a first-century Jewish rabbi. We've said that over and over again. Jesus is a first-century Jewish rabbi being followed by at least 12 Jewish boys, Jewish men. And one of his goals is to educate them, right? One of his goals is to train them in his way, in the way of Jesus, in his teaching, to take his yoke upon them, or his way of living. And his goal is that someday they might be like him. They might do as he did. They might speak as he speaks. That they might live as he lives, in word and in deed. And so what if what seems to be an equally callous and rude response by Jesus is actually a brilliantly subversive way of dealing with deep and long-standing prejudices by naming them out loud and then opening a door for a whole new way of thinking that's going to change the game forever. See, we get stuck on we get stuck on this verse. But what if Jesus is actually naming or verbalizing a long-standing, deep prejudice deep within the hearts of every Jewish boy standing there in the room listening to him? You know, people do this and have been very effective at doing this because sometimes long-standing, unhealthy, broken attitudes and prejudices need to be verbalized in order to expose them, don't they? Exhibit A.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
I don't even know what nullification and interposition is, whatever King says there. But the way that King talked, naming, verbalizing long-standing, deep prejudices within a society, calling them out and then calling them to account and providing a different way. That was part of the brilliance of King, wasn't it? It's what he did so effectively. And so what if knowing that his closest followers, knowing how they see this woman, knowing their deep, long-standing prejudices against her, what if, knowing that they see her as a nothing, what if Jesus kind of goes along with that for a minute and kind of reflects back to them their own attitudes and thoughts? He says what they expect him to say, right? That's what they expect. And what if it's meant not to affirm them? What if it's meant, rather, to convict, even embarrass, when they see their deepest, long-standing prejudices verbalized in their face? And they have to look at this woman who has a suffering daughter, and they have to see her, and then they hear this verbalized. And what if he knows this woman, and he knows she ain't going anywhere? Because what if he knows she's going to persist? She's not going to give up. And I'm going to use this moment as an opportunity to open up a door, a good news gospel door. And we're going to flip the script and immortalize this woman forever. Her response is amazing. She says, "Lord," she replied, "even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." It's like that's the moment she should, duck her head and leave, right? Okay, the rabbi just put me in my place. I've heard it. I knew it. I knew that's where I stand. Might as well leave. She decides to speak. And she says, "Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." You know, this is the first time in the book of Mark anybody calls him Lord. First time. The Jewish men have no idea who he is. Over and over again. They're like, "We don't know. I don't know. Who is he? Even the wind and the waves obey it. We don't get it. We don't get it." She's like, "Lord, I know exactly who you are and what you can do for my daughter. Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Those 12 boys had just, if you read the chapter before, they had just picked up 12 basketfuls of bread. They had so much bread, they didn't even know what to do with it. They're like, "What do we do with all this goodness and generosity?" And she's like, "I just want a crumb. That's all I want. You boys have 12 basketfuls of bread. I'm just asking for the smallest crumb because I know that's all it will take when it comes from him. I know that's all it will take is the smallest of crumbs." And it's that response that deals a death blow to their carefully nurtured prejudices against women and Gentiles. That's a death blow right there. And Jesus uses that and sees her faith. And in the next scene, it says, then he told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Her concern for her child was so deep, and her confidence in Jesus, her faith in his ability was so profound that she would proceed and persist no matter how many doors were slammed in her face. And Jesus sees this, and he honors it, and without even seeing her daughter, he just says, go home. The demon has left. It's the first time in the gospel we see he basically takes authority over the impure spirit, and he doesn't even need to be in the same area. He's just like, it will leave. By the time you get home, it will be gone. And he's right. It's gone. And I want to honor her example. And I want to use it for us today as a bit of a model. We never meet the woman's daughter in the story, do we? We never meet her. Her daughter never shows up. Her daughter never asks to be healed, never asks to be delivered. But because of the tenacious love and the faith of a mother, it's done. And you know what? We find this over and over again. If you kind of read this through Mark, we see this play itself out over and over again. I mean, in the very next story, the one that I like and teach to the 8th graders because it makes Jesus look really good, in the very next story, there's a deaf and mute man, and all it says is some people brought him to Jesus. He never seems to want to go. It's like other people bring him to Jesus and are like, hey, can you heal him? And Jesus does. Mark chapter 2, remember the paralyzed man? Does he want to go see Jesus in that house that's too crowded to get into? We never know, but 4 of his friends pick him up and carry him there. And then they're willing to carry him up on top of a roof and go through any barrier, including the tiles on the roof, and they rip through it to get their friend to Jesus. And if you read that passage in Mark 2 carefully, it says this, when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the man, your sins are forgiven, and then heals him. He did not see the faith of the man lying on the mat. It says he looked up and saw the faith of the ones that loved their friend so much they would rip through a roof to get him to Jesus. We see this over and over again. Jesus profoundly moving in the lives of people who don't ask him to because of the profound and persistent faith of other people. Others who persist. Others who push through boundaries and barriers to get people to Jesus because they know that he's the only answer to what ails them. I wonder if in the room today, there are any of us sitting here who, when I said that, names and faces of people started popping into your head who are not here in this room right now. And you know they need to be at the feet of Jesus. People that you dearly love. Family members, friends, coworkers, neighbors. They're hurting. They're addicted. They're oppressed. They're depressed. They're lost. There's whatever it might be. And you know that what they need more than anything else this morning is they need someone to bring them to Jesus because they're not going to come on their own. They can't get here. They're not going to get to they need someone else's faith to work on their behalf. And I bet when you think of that person, I bet there are also barriers in your mind. Oh, they would never. No. All of these barriers and boundaries start popping to mind as well, right? Oh, the history we have, that would be so awkward. The fear, the isolation, they don't do the religious thing. That makes them uncomfortable. And so whatever it might be, the barriers, the boundaries start popping up just as quickly. Might it be your faith and not their faith that brings a breakthrough in their life? What if it's going to be your faith? It's not going to be their faith. It's going to be your faith on their behalf that's going to bring the breakthrough, because Jesus consistently in the Gospels responds to the faith of persistent people who really love other people and want to see Jesus at work in their life too. And I don't believe anything has changed. So here's what we're going to do. Rainier's going to play his guitar. And Kendall, are you here? I gave Kendall a bunch of cards. Yeah, she's like, I stashed them in a pocket, I hope. Kendall's going to give out some cards to everybody in the room as Rainier plays. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask the Spirit of God now to identify some people, a person, one person, that as Rainier plays and as I pray, I want to identify someone that you can say, I'm going to bring them to the feet of Jesus. I will push through whatever barrier and boundary to get them to Jesus because I know he's the answer for everything in their life. And maybe you are at the end of your resource. You are at the end of your advice. You are at the end of your prayer. Whatever it might be, you're like, I don't really have it. I can't have that conversation with them again. We just keep going round and round. I don't know what to tell them. Maybe there's something physical going on in their life, and it prevents them from living and flourishing in the way that Jesus would intend them to. Or maybe it's an emotional thing, or maybe there's just something, a block. And I'm going to pray in a minute, and what I'd simply like the Spirit of God to do is whoever the Spirit identifies, would you write that name on that card? It just says, today in faith, I'm going to exercise my faith, and I bring this person before you, Jesus. Someone who is not here. Maybe it's someone who used to walk with Jesus and is far from him now. Maybe it is someone that you just know is alone. They're isolated. Or maybe they show up, but they don't show up, if you know what I mean. And maybe it's your faith. And maybe it's your commitment that's going to bring the breakthrough in their life. And so let's just quiet our souls for a moment. Let's ask the Spirit of God to identify someone. And then would you commit to like the rest of this week just praying for whomever the Spirit brings to mind in your life? Commit to praying for that person. And if you really get bold, maybe even engaging a conversation with them again. Maybe it's a simple note, a text, whatever it might be, however the Spirit prompts you in their life. But I get the sense today that I know there are people in your life that you're like, they need Jesus. He's the answer. They don't know he's the answer maybe. They've forgotten that he's the answer. So today, I'm going to bring them. They're not here. I'm going to bring them to Jesus today in faith. Holy Spirit, we ask you right now, would you start bringing faces to mind? Pictures of people we love, we care for, we're concerned about. For some of us, it's a roommate. For some of us, it's a sibling. For some of us, it's a spouse. For some of us, it's a coworker, a child, someone who is not here, someone who is hurting, suffering, in pain, alone, depressed, whatever it might be. And in faith right now, in this room, we're going to bring these people to you, Jesus. We're going to bring them to your feet. We're going to push through whatever barriers, whatever fear, whatever doubt, whatever disillusionment we might have with this person. We push through whatever barriers there might be because we know they were created for something more. We know they weren't created for this. And so we push through all of that to bring them to you. We follow the example of a Greek, Syrian, Phoenician, unnamed Gentile. We honor her and we follow her example by bringing these people to you. And we will persist, and we will push, and we will continue to ask until you answer. Because we know you love them more than we do. If you have a name already, write their name down on your card. And as you look at it, just say, Jesus, I bring this simply. Jesus, I don't know where else to take them. I bring them to you. You can heal them. You can deliver them. You can set them, you can change their story. I bring them to you. Maybe that's why Mark put this story in his book. Maybe he knew we need to step on a rake every now and then. Sometimes we need to be woke up. Yeah. What are we willing to cross? What are we willing to do? What barriers and boundaries are we willing to push through to get people to Jesus? Last thing, we're going to sing. If you would like, sometimes it takes like a symbolic, and sometimes it's good to identify someone. Symbolically, if this would help you, it would be meaningful to you, we have a cross right over here. And from time to time, we just lay things at the feet of Jesus. And so symbolically, if you have someone's name on a card, you don't know where to do it, as Rainier plays and as we kind of worship ourselves out the door, you're free to move around and just walk over and say, Jesus, I give them to you again. And maybe you've been doing this for years. Keep on, persist in faith. Amen? Rainier, let's stand together.